Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time we took a look at the theory of Schwartz and Sharp, and that was an important theory for linking wisdom to virtue and positive psychology, and we saw the deep connections between wisdom and the cultivation and practice of virtue. We made some criticisms of Schwartz and Sharp. I argued that they should include Sophia and not just phronesis. If you remember those, they were invoking Aristotle's two notions of wisdom and giving priority to phronesis. I think you need both, as Aristotle argued, Sophia and phronesis in order to be virtuous. I also argued that their attempt to explain phronesis with expertise, I think, was confused, and we should put that aside. And then we took from that some ideas about the developmental aspect. That's of course central to Aristotle. Remember, he brought the developmental dimension to wisdom, and how much wisdom is becoming a virtuous person. Other things I think are lacking in the theory, and we'll come back to this, that there wasn't much discussion about the connection between wisdom and meaning in life. But we then passed to taking a look at a theory that took very seriously the connection between wisdom and virtue, and this is the seminal theory work of Baltz and Staudinger. We took a look at the idea of the meta-heuristics, pragmatics, right, for orchestrating mind and virtue and excellence, and they talked about the fundamental pragmatics of life. I pointed out to you that a way making sense conjointly of the invocation of meta-heuristics and both senses of pragmatics is this idea that its core to wisdom is this capacity for relevance realization, obviously improved in some fundamental way, which I think means that there's integral connections between wisdom and intelligence via the notion of rationality that we've already been developing together. And then we took a look at the 5 criteria, where there was clear invocations of propositional knowledge, procedural knowledge. The contextualism, I argued, can be best be seen as perspectival knowing. I argued against their notion of relativism and argued instead for humility and fallibilism. And then, obviously, I think that's sorry, that was maybe too harsh to them. I think it's pretty clear that many of the seminal figures of wisdom figures from the past were not moral relativists or relativists in any significant way. So I strongly recommend replacing relativism with fallibilism and humility. And then finally, the 5th criteria is that wisdom is applicable to domains in which there is uncertainty. And of course, as I've already argued, that's a huge aspect of our life and our cognition because of ill-definedness, combinatorial explosion, et cetera, which again means relevance realization is being strongly presupposed. I want to give you some further quotes to indicate what's going on about that. So they talk about wisdom having to do with generativity, flexibility, and efficiency in application. And of course the generativity, but the flexibility, but also the efficiency are bringing together many of the ideas that we've been talking about with relevance realization. They talk about it taking place, listen to this language, within the frame of bounded rationality. They're invoking the notion here from Simon of bounded rationality. This is rationality that is taking place within a framing. It's taking place within the constraints of combinatorial explosion, within the constraints of working with ill-definedness. It's a notion of rationality deeply enmeshed with relevance realization. They talk about these are all quotes I'm giving you, by the way, highly complex sets of information about the meaning and conduct of life are highly complex, okay, are reduced quickly, listen to this, to their essentials without being lost in the never-ending process of information search. Notice that, combinatorial explosion directly being invoked here, that were to occur if wisdom was treated as a case of unbounded rationality. So I think it's pretty clear from all of those quotes that they are directly invoking the machinery of relevance realization. I pointed out that with their criteria, they were able to begin the operationalization of wisdom, and some of the first experimental work. They found that a cognitive style in which one had excellent skills of judgment seemed to be predictive of the ability to do well in the experiments. They also found that discussing with another person or imagining discussing with another person enhanced your capacity for wisdom, challenging an individualistic notion of rationality, going back to Descartes and assumed, if you remember, by Cohen in his arguments. And but what's really interesting about that is, of course, this brings up the relevance of Platonic dialogue, but also the Stoic idea of internalizing the sage, because the case where people imagine talking to a significant other was just as efficacious as actually talking to a significant other, and both of those were more efficacious than just giving more time to think and reflect on your own. I pointed out that one plausible explanation for why this works is that you're getting something like what Igor Grossman has shown with the Solomon effect, that the move to take the perspective of other people, move to a third-person perspective, really enhances I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get a drink. I seem to have something caught in my throat. Really enhances one's ability to overcome the transparency and the bias induction of one's own perspective. And that can be facilitated, of course, if you not only are taking the perspective of somebody who's present, but you can do that by simulating them internally, and eventually you could internalize that perspective the way we talked about with the Stoics internalizing Socrates. And one can learn to, remember this, one can learn to converse with oneself, dialogue with oneself, do something like enlinkis with oneself and provoke aporia, provoke the challenge and the demand for transformative change. So I think all of this is really excellent work on their part. I noted that they also, like Schwartz and Sharp, I think make the mistake of trying to understand wisdom in terms of expertise, and I'm not going to repeat that argument, and I think that it is a kind of fundamental mistake. I think understanding wisdom on the lines of something like rationality is a much more fruitful connection. Now, what are some further criticisms of Balt and Staudinger? I think one of the most important criticisms I would make, other than the ones I've made about expertise and not being very clear on explicating the role of perspectival knowing, that's kind of an unfair criticism because it's anachronistic, but we should at least endeavor to bring that into our account of wisdom, given their own experiment and given the further work of Igor Grossman. I would also say that one of my criticisms, and this is a criticism that I made with Leo Ferraro in the 2013 article we published on wisdom, I would argue that there's a mistake here at a more theoretical and conceptual level. It's a mistake of omission, not commission. What we're getting here is a product theory of wisdom, in which what you're trying to do is to come up with sort of the account of what wisdom is. And that's a valuable thing. You should definitely do that. You should try and come up with, not just a feature list, of course. That's a little bit of a problem with just the list of criteria, of course. But what you do is you want to come up with, what am I going to do? I'm going to find wise people, or I'm going to get sort of, widely shared definitions of wisdom and try and come up with an account of what wisdom is based on that. And that's a legitimate thing to do. It omits something that's very important, though. It omits what we saw as so central to the ancient theories of wisdom that we were looking at. Right? If you look at Plato, even Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, and if you look at the Buddha, right, and the centrality of transformational change in wisdom is being lost in a product theory. What you also need, and these two should talk to each other, you need a process theory. You need a theory, and this is what I think the ancient theories of wisdom are. You basically are, what you're getting is an account that works something like this in a process theory. You have an independent account of what is foolishness, right? And what is flourishing. And then what a process theory tells me is how I can overcome foolishness and how I can afford flourishing. And then from that, it tries to derive what wisdom is. And I think this is a very important thing to do, to try and figure out what wisdom is from an account of how one becomes wise. Because first of all, it taps into this long-standing and important philosophical heritage. So there's a tremendous legacy that we've explored in this course that we should be making use of. And secondly, it does something that I think is much clearer than what a product theory does, which is it picks up on the central insight that McGee and Barber talked about, which is seeing through illusion and into reality. The process theory gives you an account of what self-deception is and how you can see through it and into reality so that you can be better connected to yourself, to other people, to the world, and thereby flourish. So I would advocate that in addition, not in competition, but complementary to a product theory, we should be developing a process theory. Tells us what foolishness is, how foolishness develops, how we can overcome foolishness, how we can afford flourishing, and then on the basis of that, get into a dialogue with accounts of what wisdom is. So I think that's important. I mean, the fact that Aristotle's being invoked really says we need to bring in the developmental and transformative aspects of wisdom in a more serious manner. So that's one of my most central criticisms of Bolton-Stoniger. The other one, like I said, is they seem to make a mistake around expertise. I would now like to share with you some central criticisms made by a really seminal thinker, somebody I've had the chance to meet a couple times and interact with, and this is Monica Ardelt. I think she did something really important. The critique she published of Bolton-Stoniger in 2004 and her ongoing work. She's generated one of the wisdom scales that is used experimentally. She's generated a lot of experimental work. Monica's work is really important and central. Now, I'm going to use some of my language that we've developed in this course to talk about Monica, and I hope it's not imposing on her, but I think it's plausible that it's not. Her main criticism of the Bolton-Stoniger paradigm or approach is they confuse, this is her criticism and I agree with it, they're confusing having theoretical knowledge about wisdom with being a wise person. So there's a sense in which there's a bit of a modal confusion going on in the Bolton-Stoniger theory. It's like, I have a lot of knowledge about wisdom, that doesn't make me wise. So I'm an excellent case in point of that, I would think. I mean, I've read a lot of the wisdom literature, both the philosophical and the psychological. I teach on it. I'm involved with, there's currently some experimental work, etc. So I think I have quite a bit of theoretical knowledge about wisdom. I would not in any way dare to equate that with the claim that I'm a wise person. While that knowledge, I think, could be argued to be necessary, I think what Ardelt is clearly pointing to is that it's nowhere near sufficient. It's nowhere near sufficient. And so what I think she's pointing to is the fact that a wise person, and we can think of the Socratic example here about the truth and the transformative relevance needing to be kept together. The wise person must realize these theoretical truths within a process of self-transformation. Must realize this within a process of self-transformation. So people that are wise have gone through a process of self-transformation. They have achieved a significant kind of self-transcendence that allows them to embody and enact these truths rather than just having them in a propositional fashion. So Ardelt is clearly pointing towards something missing, right? The importance of the process of development. She's also importantly pointing to the way in which wisdom is a project of becoming a particular kind of person, and so she, right, a particular kind of person living in a particular kind of world, right, and so she's directly pointing towards what I've articulated in this course as participatory knowing. So she then brings out something very important about this distinction. She makes use this distinction between having knowledge and being wise, and she makes use of a distinction from a really important philosopher, John Keeks. I've mentioned him before. Done some important work on moral wisdom and its relationship to virtue. And Keeks makes a very important distinction between descriptive knowledge and interpretive knowledge. Which Monica points to. And what Ardelt is pointing to is, of course, that wisdom has to do more with this. So descriptive knowledge is basically your knowledge that, the cat is a mammal, your knowledge that the cat is a predator, or something like that. Interpretive knowledge is your ability, right, to grasp the significance of your descriptive knowledge. Now that's going to be important because that actually turns out to be a central feature in most of the theories that are now being developed about what understanding is and how it differs from knowledge. And I think what Ardelt is pointing to here by invoking Keeks' notion of interpretive knowledge, right, is the centrality of understanding to wisdom. And of course, grasping the significance is putting us, I'm going to argue later that this, of course, is going to have to do with construal, and this is going to have to do about, of course, with relevance realization. Now, I think that's very important work, and I think the fact that there's so much happening in this theory, and the thing is, it's happening in a very sort of concise fashion. So let's gather what we've got here. We've got the realization that we shouldn't be just talking about having knowledge about wisdom. We should be going through the process of self-transcendence by which we become wise. That involves, right, as I said, a process theory. We're going to need a process theory, not just a product theory. And that what the wise person has above and beyond knowledge, I would call descriptive knowledge, and interpretive knowledge. Whether that's knowledge, I don't know. But that's at least what many people are considering understanding, and this has to do, as I'm going to argue, with that I'm going to argue that grasping the significance of your knowledge is good construal that realizes what's relevant. So Ardelt then talks about the personality characteristics that you should see in the wise person. So she thinks that if we want to talk about what it is to be a wise person, we shouldn't just be talking about the knowledge, obviously. We should be talking about the kind of characteristics that the wise person has. And that's important because we've already seen the deep connections between wisdom and virtue. So she thinks that there are three ways in which we can judge the relative value, we can grasp the significance of our knowledge. There's three domains. Mom, that's not right. I don't want to say domain. There's three dimensions of our personhood that are crucial for being a wise person. She thinks and up until now, we've been clearly giving these emphasis. There are cognitive factors. Right? And so what are the cognitive factors here? This, of course, is your ability to have a comprehension of the significance and meaning of information. Okay, and not just theoretically. The significance of the information for your development, for your going through a process of self-transcendence and becoming a wise person. Then there are reflective, and I think the distinction here, this is picking up a bit on the way rationality has this reflective component into it, as opposed to intelligence, which is just your ability to grasp what's relevant. So I think that's something that can be integrated quite well with the discussion we had on rationality. So the reflective factors, a person who has been cultivating wisdom is multi-perspectival. They're capable, excuse me, I don't know what's wrong with my throat. They're capable of engaging in multiple perspectives. They're capable of self-examination, self-awareness, self-insight. So notice again that the reflection here has an existential import. You're taking these perspectives, but you can ultimately, internalize this perspectival ability onto yourself in self-reflection, self-examination, self-insight. So I think that's very valuable. And then there's an affective component. And I'm doing this because Ardelt clearly thinks that these three are mutually influencing, mutually constraining, causally interacting with each other. So the affective dimension, she talks about in terms of compassion. I've made a case because of some of the models she invokes from Buddhism, I don't think this is inappropriate. I've made a case that the capacity for agape is the best way of understanding compassion. The main idea here is, and this is why I'm invoking agape as opposed to either philia or eros, is because it helps to overcome egocentrism. And you can see how these two are working together, right? This is helping to overcome egocentrism in kind of a powerful way. So this is sort of overcoming egocentrism perspectivally, and this is overcoming egocentrism attitudinally, and in terms of your core motivations, your core set of priorities and preferences, basically the way in which you're caring about the world, and that your caring is directed towards the flourishing of other persons. So I think that also is an important improvement in the theorizing. The fact that Ardelt is clearly giving equal priority to cognitive, I would call, these are perspectival, and the perspectival aspects of rationality, and of course the important affective things. And if you remember, this does something also, at least implicitly, that we don't have in the Baltzan-Staudinger. And so this is one other criticism I would make on behalf of Monica Ardelt of the Baltzan-Staudinger theory, which is agape, starts to, I've argued, so I'm not attributing this argument to Ardelt, but I'm supplementing it to her theory, because what agape gives is, it at least gives a way of trying to talk about meaning in life, the way Wolff talked about. And I argued that agape helps us to get that kind of connectedness and caring that is so central to grounding meaning in life. We don't have to ground meaning in life in being subjectively attracted to something that's completely objectively attractive. We just have to be transjectively coupled to those things we find inherently valuable because of their connection to meaning making, coherence, and caring. And so this allows, what it affords, and I would argue enables Ardelt's theory to do, is to connect her account of wisdom to meaning in life in a much more direct fashion. That connection to meaning in life is not clear in Boltzmann-Staudinger. And if you remember, Wolff argues that you can't reduce meaning in life to morality. So the connection between wisdom and virtue, while central and being discussed well by Schwartz and Sharp and by Boltzmann-Staudinger, is not reducible to, it's not sufficient for the connection between wisdom and meaning in life. By bringing in this affective component and the idea that we are becoming wise, not just thinking about wisdom, and so the process of identification, the modal existential aspects, Ardelt is doing a lot more about connecting wisdom to meaning in life. And I think that's very, very important. Okay, so this is sort of understanding in a sense I'm going to help develop later, right? But this ability to pick up on what, to realize the significance of your knowledge and allow you, and again, in an existential fashion, not just abstract theoretical, but in a way that allows you to, I would argue, ultimately see through illusion and into reality so that you can afford your development. Then that is connected to your reflective capacity, your perspectival knowing, which ultimately could be linked to the stuff we saw with Grossman's work and in the Berlin paradigm of Boltzmann-Staudinger, right? The ability to take the perspective of others, being multiple perspectival, and ultimately turn that back on oneself in self-examination, internalize it, right, in self-insight, and that those two are also linked to something like a capacity for agape. And I would argue that you need these two for overcoming egocentrism, and it also, I haven't seen Monica develop this very explicitly in connection, especially with Wolff's work, but there's the real potential here of connecting wisdom to something other than virtue. It should be connected to virtue, but it should also be importantly connected to meaning in life. What are some of my criticisms of Ardelt's work? Well, it clearly invokes transformational processes. It doesn't really incorporate a theory of transformative experience or an account of it, like we have in L.A. Paul's work. It doesn't really give us a processing theory. It points towards and this is important, it points towards the need for a processing theory, but it doesn't give us an account of what that process looks very much like. And it doesn't have an independent account of foolishness. It doesn't really tell us very much what foolishness is, and that's something needed if we're going to, I would argue, to have a good process theory of wisdom. There is an untapped potential. This isn't so much a criticism as encouragement that there's an untapped potential given this theoretical machinery of connecting wisdom to meaning in life in a way that complements the connections between wisdom and virtue. So I think these are all some very important features about this. I've already indicated, grasping the significance. I think this points towards RR. We've already talked a lot about agape and the relationships I tried to draw between it and relevance realization. And of course, I've already indicated this is bringing in the recursive aspects, it's bringing in perspectival knowing. And there's also, at least in the background sense, the participatory knowing, because one is coming to know oneself differently as one is coming to know the world differently because one is going through this inherent transformational process. So we're seeing how the theory of wisdom is sort of building up. It's becoming more complex. It's bringing in different aspects, different kinds of knowing. There is, quite important aspects of relevance realization in Schwartz and Sharp, clearly in Boltzmann-Staudinger, quite strongly implied in the central role, at least in the cognitive aspects, although I would argue also in the reflective and the affective aspects of Ardelt's theory. Relevance realization is playing an important role. And we can see how it's getting like we see how it's getting sort of developed and specified into and connected to other important cognitive processes. All right. I think the next important theory we should turn to is Sternberg. So, and this is because you can see Sternberg's work running throughout the history. Robert Sternberg's work running through the history of the psychology of wisdom. Robert Sternberg basically really gets this off the ground with his pivotal work, not only in his own theories, but the tireless work he's done in putting together anthologies, various anthologies on wisdom or related anthologies on foolishness. Why Smart People Can Be So Stupid is one of the best anthologies on the psychology of foolishness I've seen. Right. He's also been tireless in trying to connect the psychology of wisdom to pedagogy. He gets, right, again, something that is important and central, and we see it crucially in the ancient theories of wisdom. It's not so clearly present in the current psychological theories, but the deep connection between wisdom and teaching, that's of course clearly the case in Socrates. It's clearly the case in Jesus of Nazareth. It's clearly the case in Buddhism, that there, like in the work of the Buddha, that there's a deep connection between wisdom and education. And so he's been very tireless, not only sort of theoretically pointing out that connection, but trying to work out, if you'll allow me, I mean this word in a complimentary sense, trying to engineer some psychotechnology, sets of practices for how to bring the cultivation of wisdom into the educational domain. So, so for many reasons, Sternberg is a pivotal figure in the wisdom, I was going to call it the wisdom industry. That sounds like an industry for producing wisdom. In the community of people who are endeavoring to come up with a psychological, cognitive scientific, even neuroscientific theory of wisdom. There are some people who are pursuing this. Meeks and Jest are one. Other people are pursuing the neuroscientific aspects, but I'm not going to go into that in great detail right now. I'm trying to concentrate on the psychological theories, precisely because they are the ones that are most directly accessible and relevant to trying to respond to the meaning crisis. So in 1998, Sternberg, he had an earlier theory where he was talking, and he's come back to this many times. He has a book where he tries to talk about the relationships between intelligence, wisdom, and creativity. And I'm trying to follow that up in my own way, trying to show you the relationships between intelligence, rationality, wisdom, insight, etc. So definitely influenced by Sternberg in that way. But he then came up with a more, I want to be complimentary of the newer theory without being completely dismissive of the older. I would say the newer theory is sort of more coherent, more tightly integrated, more explicated. So in 1998, he came up with what he's called and maintained a balanced theory of wisdom. That's actually the title of the 1998 article, a balanced theory of wisdom. So the notion of balance is going to play a crucial role in this theory. Now, Sternberg starts by talking about Sophia and phronesis and episteme, which is at the core of epistemological. That's what I would call propositional knowledge. He calls it scientific understanding. He quickly drops that as not being particularly relevant to wisdom, not because knowledge is unimportant, because everybody knows the centrality of knowledge to wisdom. That's why we're spending so much time on getting knowledge in this course. But everybody pretty much also understands that wisdom is something above and beyond scientific, theoretical, propositional knowledge. Okay, so that's sort of easily understandable. He also, like I said, he invokes Sophia, and talks about it in sort of connection with contemplation, and phronesis and practical wisdom. He zeroes in, like Schwartz and Sharp, on phronesis. I think that's, again, a little bit too much of a neglect of the important role of Sophia. He also draws on Polanyi's idea of tacit knowledge. Remember we talked about that when we talked about subsidiary awareness. And he talks about the tacit knowledge having to do with our procedural abilities. It's relevant to attaining goals. It's not explicitly taught. We experience it intuitively. And so he is invoking all kinds of important aspects about implicit learning, intuition, and procedural knowing. I think that's good. I think he needs to also add to that techne, what are some important psychotechnologies, especially since I think, in fairness, say that he is trying to engineer such psychotechnologies in his pedagogical endeavors. I also think he needs to try to do what Aristotle did, which is integrate how phronesis, which is largely happening in an implicit, intuitive, sort of S1 kind of fashion, is integrated with Sophia, which can have a more reflective, perhaps a more S2 aspect to it. All right, that being said, what's the core theory? Well, the idea is and this is important because it's just sort of directly invoked, right? He invoked the tacit knowledge is also, right, it's used as a way of, he starts talking about it as tacit understanding. So the tacit knowing, the implicit learning is also a way in which Sternberg tries to invoke the capacity for understanding. Now that isn't very well explicated in the account. I'm thinking, I'm speculating, that what I think he's trying to get at is that the machinery by which we sort of grasp the significance of our knowledge and use it to directly and intuitively cope with the world is a significant component of understanding. So I think that's why the shift is there. He then talks, and the reason why I want to invoke that is because what the tacit understanding is doing, it's again so pregnant with aspects of relevance realization. Because he talks about the understanding guiding our ability to adapt to, listen to that language, to adapt to situations, to shape them, and that doesn't necessarily mean physical, it can mean how we construe them, how we formulate our problems, and the selection of environments, the selection, the moving around, the exploring or exploiting. This is all very much doing with relevance realization. He talks about these abilities are needed to deal with practical problems. This is why he's emphasizing wisdom not as the same thing as theoretical knowledge. He's picking up on the same point that Monica Ardell did. But he said, these practical problems, quote, are unformalized or in need of I misquoted, and that misquotation was an important mistake. These problems are unformulated, much more relevant to problem formulation, are unformulated or in need of reformulation. And so he's invoking problem formulation here. He's, of course, with the notion of reformulation, he's invoking the notion of insight. And so we can see, again, the relevance realization machinery being invoked. So his theory, quote, involves, quote, views. Let me start that again. His theory, quote, views wisdom as inherent in the interaction between an individual and a situational context. It's inherently transjective. It's about fitting. In fact, he then goes on to say, wisdom depends on the fit of a wise solution to its context. So notice the fittedness, right? All of the language that we've developed is being directly invoked, is being put at the center of the theory. And I'm going to argue that what he's invoking when he's invoking balance is he's invoking optimization. And I've, of course, argued that relevance realization is an optimization theory. So what's sort of beautiful about the theory is he gives a schematic diagram of it, and I'll draw this for you. So here's our tacit understanding. That's that implicit processing, etc. Remember, we talked about that so much in connection with flow. And what's happening is it is dealing with trying to balance your interests. Right, balance your interests, what you're interested in, what you find salient, important. And he talks about three kinds. There's the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and the extrapersonal. So this, of course, is interest between people. This is interest within a person. So you can think of Plato here trying to get your various centers and what they're interested in coordinated together. And extrapersonal. Having to do, I think this is ultimately how you're connected to yourself, how you're connected to other people, and how you're connected to the world. I think he's invoking, at least implicitly, the three dimensions of connectedness that go into meaning in life. And so I think at least implicitly we can make a clear argument here that he's trying to connect wisdom to meaning in life. Okay? And that this capacity for sort of zeroing in on relevant information is playing an important role in that. And the reason why I say that is because it's not clear to me why the arrows only go one way. It seems to me that well, this is a criticism I would make. I think the arrows, right, should go both ways because there's also going to be feedback. But anyways, they feed forward to the three things that are clearly, I would argue, are which is, right, the adapting, the shaping, and the selecting. I'll come back to that notion. The triangles are meant to indicate balance, and I've tried to indicate to you that I think I'll put that down here, and we'll come back to it. That balance has to do with optimization. Okay, so what's going on here is, right, this is a balance of your response to, right, the environmental context. So this is balancing your interests, and this is balancing your response. Okay, like I said, that's pretty clear, our relevance realization stuff. This then is directed towards, he argues, the common good. Here again is where I have to step aside from the value he's articulating and the theory he's generating. I agree, especially within a liberal democratic framework, deeply influenced by Christianity, that the common good is an overarching value for us. I'm not sure that that is going to be universally shared by all people who I think can reasonably be deemed wise individuals. So if you're in a culture that's what this means, maybe you have to bend this so much then it's then trivial. It doesn't mean, maybe it doesn't mean common in the sense of shared by everyone. It might be, you're in some sort of hierarchical feudal society and the common good isn't that everybody equally benefits from it. It might be more that everybody is working well together, some sort of justification like that. I'm not trying to justify a hierarchical society or anything like that. I want you clearly to understand, I think this is an important value. I'm just concerned here that Sternberg is being anachronistic here, and he's using one of our central values and attributing it to every person who has been wise. I'm not sure. I think you could make a case that that's clearly the case in Jesus or the Buddha. Not sure that it's the case for Marcus Aurelius and all of the Stoics. It's clearly not the case for Epictetus. So I'm hesitant about putting that up there. I'm going to advise that there's something I think more broadly comprehensive. I think the things that we should put up here are things that there's already a consensus on, a broader notion of virtue. Oh, sorry. That really makes it sound like I'm making an emphasis here. Right? That what we're really concerned with is virtue, right? And because of this, I think, and meaning in life. Okay, I have changed. That is not in his model. I have changed it because of, again, I'm worried that his particular term is anachronistic and idiosyncratic to our particular historical, cultural context. It's important to also note that running alongside of this is values and then arrows that are kind of indeterminately pointing. So trying to interpret what that means is something like the wise person is being constrained by values. What those values are not clear. Again, is it that we're talking about things like meaning in life and the virtues? Perhaps. So another criticism I have is that this part of the theory, this part of the diagram, the way it's operating is unclear. It might be something as basic as the wise person is working normatively. They're trying to get the best, and then this is not that interesting a claim because wisdom is itself a normative notion, and therefore the fact that the wise person is being governed by normativity is almost definitional. If it means something specific, like the wise person has a specific set of values, that needs to be explicated and defended. So I don't know quite what to do with that. So I have to sort of leave it somewhat inert. What I would argue, and I think what these triangles indicate, and what the language indicates, is the balance is used to adapt, shape, and select environments. And what is this balance? He argues it's something like Piaget's equilibration between assimilation and accommodation. He argues that it's a balance between coping with novelty and proceduralization. Do you see what the balance here is? It's balance that is directly invoking a lot of the machinery we've talked about relevance realization, and he's clearly not invoking sort of a spatial balancing. He's invoking optimization. So I think this theory is also a theory that is deeply integratable with a lot of the material we've been discussing. Relevance realization is playing a key role in terms of the balancing and this process here, also down here at the level of grasping the significance, at least intuitively, of our knowledge and the patterns we've picked up from the environment. There's deep connections to, or at least there's a real potential in Sternberg's theory for making deep connections to meaning in life, because, as I said, I think this is pretty clearly how you connect to yourself, how do you connect to others, how do you connect to the world, right? There's important possible connections, possibly, I'm unsure, between this and virtue and meaning in life. So this is all very good. And like I said, overall, this is clearly a dynamic optimization, and it's invoking something very much like relevance realization. All right. What are some of criticisms? Well, I'll leave that on the board for now. What are some of the criticisms of Sternberg? This is still, in the end, a product theory. It's not a process theory. It doesn't make this avoids equating wisdom with expertise, and that's a powerful advantage of this theory. but there, like I said, this domain, the values, unexplicated, it could either be a somewhat trivial because it's almost tautological that the wise person is acting according to normative standards, or it could be a much more controversial claim that specific values are involved. I don't know. I've already told you I don't think that the common good is the goal of all wise people. That seems anachronistic to me in an important way. The theory could clearly be improved by getting clearer about the nature of tacit implicit learning, getting clearer about optimization, getting clearer about relevance realization, getting clearer about how relevance realization connects to meaning in life. So all of those things would be developed if one started to develop a process theory and not just a product theory. So Sternberg needs an independent theory of foolishness. Now he has a theory of foolishness, but it's not independent. His theory of foolishness is basically, foolishness is an imbalance in these things. So what foolishness is basically a lack of wisdom. And again, while that's definitionally the case, what you need is an independently constructed theory of wisdom. A theory of foolishness. You need a theory of foolishness that takes in hand, right, the centrality of seeing through illusion and into reality, that has an independent account of how we're self-deceptive, how we're self-destructive, how that operates, how that unfolds, because we see that in many of the ancient wisdom theories, and how we can ameliorate that. So I think that is missing in a central way from Sternberg's work. Okay, so I think in the end, what I want to do is try and draw all of these together. I've tried to indicate important points of improvement, one from one theory with respect to the other, relative strengths and weaknesses. I've also tried to indicate powerful points of convergence and connection to the ideas of relevance realization that we've been developing in this course, because that's part of the big plausibility diagram, to show how the machinery of relevance realization, right, can help to explain what it is to be wise and help to explain, as I'm going to argue, what it is to become wise, to give a processing theory. So we want to take that up in the next account. And I'm somewhat hesitant about that because you know, I'm sort of okay with, you know, offering you proposals. Well, I'm not. I mean, I'm very cautious about proposals about consciousness and other things like that. But, you know, we've got proposals about higher states of consciousness and insight and that. And I've tried to make arguments for that. And I'm going to make an argument that I have made with Leo Ferraro about wisdom. But there is something, it borders on hubristic to talk about this in that way. But I'm going to try and draw on this and at least show you a plausible way in which we can draw all of this material together with the theory of relevance realization and come up with an account of wisdom. And then I think also subject that theory, at least the version that was published in 2013, to some important criticisms. And then hopefully then be in a place where we can fold it back into the connections between wisdom, the cultivation of wisdom, the cultivation of meaning in life, the cultivation, the pursuit, are these the right verbs, of enlightenment, how these are all connected, and how that can be situated into the larger project of awakening from the meaning crisis. Thank you very much for your time and attention.